All right, next up, we're going to move into some more of the CDL topic, and I'm going to introduce Dave Mattson. He's going to talk to us about an assessment of the CDL disqualification process. Dave Mattson is a principal technical advisor with the US DOT Volpe Center. Since 1993, Dave has worked on motor carrier safety projects in a variety of areas, such as program performance measures, program evaluation, motor carrier and driver risk assessment, risk management, and safety program development. He also led the design and delivery of FMCSA's safety measurement system. So Dave, if you are online, could you unmute yourself?
Okay, thank you, Brenda. I'm here to talk about work we're doing. I'm with the Volpe Center, US DOT, and we work a lot with FMCSA, and this is a project that's being led out of the research division. Nicole Michael is leading it out of that division, and it's an assessment of the CDL disqualification process. And this is a different way, I think, more than what a lot of people have gone through in assessing it. We're assessing this process from the very beginning to the end. And we want to sort of take a look at it to ensure that the CDL records are correctly reflecting the disqualification, citations, and suspensions. So I think most of you are familiar with 383.51. There's a federal regulation there that mandates that, you know, certain types of violations will lead to the suspension of CDL privileges on CDL drivers. So we want to make sure that that's working right. And as part of a continuous improvement process, you've got to take a look at how well is it working. And that's what we're trying to do. How does it work at a national level? So we're looking at identifying the issues associated with citing, processing, disqualifying violations as it goes through. We're also seeing the ability for law enforcement to recognize when drivers are operating under a suspension. We hope that all this information will then lead us to increased awareness of where things can be improved amongst all the stakeholders involved in here, which is, not the states, but I would say states, it's the SDLAs. We're talking also about the courts and law enforcement. So to just tackle this problem, we're looking at, we broke down the process into 5 steps. And we're looking at it from, I'll sort of lead you through real quick. So we're looking at an inspection or law enforcement. They observe a driver doing a disqualifying event. And I use this term here, I may use it through this presentation, called potentially disqualifying violation, PDQs. Again, these are the violations that are listed in 383 that could possibly lead to a disqualification. So law enforcement observes it. Then it's up to them to sort of say, I want to write a ticket. So that takes us to the next. Now we have got a CDL citation. PDQ citation. Then that takes that information and that goes into the court system. And in the court system, they take that information and they adjudicate it. It could happen that, due process is being served there. You can be found guilty, not guilty. There's also a couple of other things that can happen there. One of the concerns is usually, masking, maybe that the violation was downgraded. Again, those are the kind of things actually, again, according to federal regulation, should not be happening for CDL drivers. So we're looking into that. Then once we get a conviction of a PDQ violation, that should then go onto the record. So that information goes to the SDLA. And the SDLA takes a look at that information, puts it on the record, and then they have to process it and say, okay, based upon this and the other violations that this driver has, I need to issue a disqualification. So then they put a disqualification. Then finally is that, well, disqualifying drivers unto itself isn't enough. You also have to be able to enforce those disqualifications. And some of that is so when this disqualification happen, and a driver basically blows it off and goes back out on the road, what's the ability of law enforcement to say that this driver is operating under a disqualifying and remove it? So as a whole, what we want to do here is make sure, is the process have integrity to remove unsafe drivers from the road so we can improve safety? Now, as part of this project, we selected 9 states. And we wanted to be able to get a good sample of what is going out nationally. So we didn't want to necessarily pick the state with the best practices, easiest data to get through. What we did is we went through various factors that we got a spectrum of various factors across our sample. So we looked at how strong was the enforcement. We looked at on a state-by-state level, we looked at the enforcement rate of these states based upon their inspection program. We took a look at their ability of how often they're detecting drivers as being disqualified, again, from that roadside inspection data. We looked at the CMV exposure. Is it a big trucking state, a small trucking state? And then we also want to get geographic variation too. So we wanted to make sure that we represent all 4 of FMCSA service centers. So we selected these states, and then for each state, what we're doing is we're looking at their CDL population. We're looking at those PDQ violations, and we're going to ability to track that through these various entities. And then we're looking at over a 3-year time frame. We started this project in 2019. And so we asked for 2016 to 18 data, 3 years of data. So the data we use in this is we had to be doing a lot of data mining, quite frankly. We had a lot of data sets that were not necessarily meant to talk to one another. So how can we link them together? We have MCMIS data, which has inspection of violations. So that's at first, you saw that in that first step. So you have inspection violations. One thing that it's embedded in that data is the ability for law enforcement to write down associated citation information. So they actually can write down a ticket number that may pertain to a particular violation listed in an inspection report. Now we also look at the court data, and this is and the court data gives us all the citations, the citation numbers, all the charge events that hit the beginning of the court process. Then they have to be adjudicated. And now we're looking at how were they adjudicated? Were they guilty, not guilty? Was there a reduction in charge, things like that. And then, so we have to take a look and then look, and again, we're only particular to those 380, 351, those PDQ violations. So we had to be able to identify those violations through that process. So we create these crosswalks. Then finally, we look at the CDL, SIDLIS. So when ultimately we have a conviction that comes out of the court, are we finding it on the SIDLIS report? And that SIDLIS report provides us not just with convictions, but also any suspensions that are based on those convictions. And then we're also looking at the SDL data. The SDL data, we look at all the suspensions that they have on their drivers in state and the time of those suspensions and the reason. Was it safety, non-safety? And again, we're going to wrap that back to the MCMIS data, and we're going to be able to figure out when those drivers are operating and being inspected in while under suspension. So we have we had one state where we had really strong data. We had enough data to provide the whole list of beginning to end. And we use that as our really sort of a proof of concept. Can we do this? If we can't do it with this data, we won't be able to do it at all. And I'd like to say was that we were able to do it. And I also want to qualify that this is our first state. The results and our approach is currently being peer reviewed by the research division. Upon their approval, we're going to go ahead and process the other states and finish the project. So here are a couple of, I thought, were interesting observations from our sort of pilot state. And that was on law enforcement. So we noted that law enforcement would write down, when they do an inspection, and say they write down speeding greater than 15 miles over. And the important thing about 15 miles and over is if it's 15 or more, that's a potentially disqualifying violation. If it's less than that, it's not a potentially disqualifying violation. So law enforcement observes a driver, writes down that they're on the roadside inspection that it was 15 miles over, and then we also happen to have a ticket number that's listed there for that particular violation. And then we go in and we look at the court data, and we were able to match it. Surprisingly, that data in MCMIS is really very well, at least for this state, was very well written. And we were able to match it. Most of the time when we had a ticket number, we could match the inspection data with the court data. We noticed that about 70, so where we were able to match it, we noticed that about 2/3 of the time, the actual ticket that was written by law enforcement was for 15 plus. The other quarter of the time, it was written for something less. So it indicates a little bit that law enforcement might be at times, this quarter time, writing a lower level violation than what they originally observed. We also looked at, again, we're talking about their ability to inspectors to detect safety-based disqualified drivers. So we looked at that SDLA data, and they gave us all their drivers that were disqualified. We looked at all the inspections that those disqualified those drivers were involved in, and we found out that 60% of the time when they were operating, 60% of the time when a disqualified driver was operating, the inspector noted a operating while disqualified violation. So a detection rate of about 60%. On the court side, we found that most of the charges of citations resulted in convictions. And so 80% of the time we found that, so most of the time if you're written up in court, you're going to be ultimately found guilty. We also look for like clear forms of masking. So this is where we get that downgrade of a potentially disqualifying violation to something lower. So an example of that is following too closely, and it's reduced to littering. And we found in this state that these instances were fairly rare, which is, I think, a very good thing. It shows that maybe that there is some awareness in that state and amongst the courts and not to reduce these violations. On the SDLA side, we found that when the convictions came on the driver's record, we found that should have led to a disqualification. We found that 86% of the time that these convictions should have led to a disqualification, there was a disqualification on SIDLIS. So again, it looks like most of the time the process of a disqualification is working. One of the things we saw that was that was interesting, it indicates maybe poor communication between the courts and the SDLA, was we found 27% of the convictions coming from the court, which should have made it onto the SIDLIS record, were just missing. We could not find them. When we did a little bit closer look at this, it wasn't like 27% across the board were missing. They seem to be very specific to certain types of violations. For example, when using a handheld telephone while driving a CMV is usually it would be a disqualifying violation. In this state, it never was cited. It was never made it on the SIDlist record. On the other hand, anytime there was a speeding violation of 15 plus, it always made it on the record. So it seems like there might be some ability to match those violations coming from court and how it's being processed among the SDLAs. There might be some room for improvement here. Finally, so after we've looked at this and we get go through the peer review, we're going to look at the remaining 8 states and provide a better national picture of the disqualifying CDL disqualifying process at a national level. And hopefully on the basis of that, we can start developing best practices and provide these, maybe provide a toolkit for states to be able to maybe conduct this kind of analysis themselves and see how, and make sure that when a driver is operating in an unsafe manner and it leads itself up to a point where they should be removed from the road, that does occur to make our roads safe. I'd also like to thank Nicole Michael. She's our point of contact out of FMCSA Research Division. If you have particular questions on this project, you can reach out to her at this email. So on that, I'd like to thank you, and I appreciate you, Brenda, giving me the opportunity to discuss this work. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, very, very interesting, very in-depth, detailed look at. So it's some interesting results so far. Do we have any questions for Dave?
We had one online here. They were wondering how often a violation for speeding 15 plus was issued, but no citation was indicated on the inspection.
I don't have that. And I think, and part of it though, I would not assume that a citation wasn't written. I'm not familiar enough with the law enforcement practices in that particular state. So we were just looking at the ones where a ticket was written. So it's very possible that that number could actually, there could be a lot of like 15 plus and the officer decided not to write it. But the problem is we have to match it with that number, with the citation number, and that's a little bit of it's like a fuzzy matching, so it's not a perfect thing to be able to do.
So I'm curious, Dave, obviously there was a lot of different data gathered from a lot of different data sources. Did you have any trouble getting data from the states at all?
Yes. It's sometimes it's been very easy, sometimes it's been very difficult. The courts in particular, when you're dealing with, I think researchers are going to come across this more and more so, is that privacy is becoming a huge issue. So we've had to, in some states, get together, put together MOUs, which is can be difficult at times. Sometimes our lawyers will not agree with their lawyers or whatever. So we've had to move from a couple of states. The other is that on a lot of this court data, is automatically expunged upon if there's no conviction. So it's like it never happened. So in some states that exists, in other states it doesn't. So it's and even then working with the SDLAs, it's sometimes hard. A lot of them are going through renovating their systems as they go through. So it's been a bit of a battle, but I find is that we have enough states here of which to come. I think, again, still paint a pretty good picture of what's happened nationally.
Great, thanks again.